Sherry. Well, good evening, everybody. I am Rabbi Dennis Sasso of Congregation Beth-El, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program of Cocktail Judaism. And before we begin our program, I think it is proper that we take note that today is a day of remembrance, a time to honor those who served and sacrificed their lives during the Second World War. We remember December 7, 1941. 79 years ago was the attack on Pearl Harbor that killed 2,403 people and brought America into the war. By the end of the war, over 407,000 American soldiers had lost their lives, and 671,000 were wounded. 407,000 dead, 671,000 wounded. So at this time, when we fight a different type of viral war, may we arise to the heroism and the nobility out of which the values of solidarity and democracy we seek to preserve were forged, defended, and transmitted to a new generation. Our program tonight is dedicated to American democracy. And this is our last program for this year. It is part 2 of a conversation we began last month on November 2nd with a distinguished panel who helped us consider the issues on the eve of the elections. The elections are over. A new administration is scheduled to take over on January 20th. And our panel this evening will help us look forward to what lies ahead. It is a panel of young voices, young leaders in our community with already proven track records in civic engagement and in community leadership. The central admonition in Judaism is Shema, listen. We are here to listen to the concerns, to the aspirations, and the insights of a new generation who will help us shape the future of our community and of our nation. We have a talented and diverse panel. Returning from last month's conversation is Rachel Birnbaum. Rachel is a Florida native who moved to Indiana in 2013 to pursue a Bachelor of Science degree at Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Sciences Affairs. She worked for federal Senator Todd Young, and from there, worked for the Indiana State Senate Republicans. Rachel is now a part of the public affairs team at ICE Miller. She was a member of the Indiana Leadership Forum's class of 2020, as well as the Bruce H. Frank, Martin L. Larner Leadership Academy class of 2020. Welcome back, Rachel. And with us also is Aaron Welcher. Aaron has been a lifelong member of the Indianapolis Jewish community who believes in building a more just and pluralistic society for all. I knew Aaron's father before he was younger than Aaron. It's great to have the continuity in the community. Aaron is Program and Communications Coordinator at the JCRC, where he is responsible for developing programs, communications, and being a resource for the press. And we value our cooperation with Aaron and with the JCRC. Aaron is Jewish and LGBTQ+. He believes in the inherent intersectionality of Jewish community as a strength. He has a passion for many causes, including ending systemic issues like anti-Semitism and racism, addressing the eviction and housing crisis, and justice for people who are immigrants and refugees. Welcome, Aaron. And also with us tonight is Naomi Farrakhan. Naomi is the advocacy coordinator at Women's for Change Indiana. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit working effort to improve the lives of Hoosier women. My wife Sandy is founder, along with Jennifer Williams, of that organization, and she has nothing but wonderful things to say about Naomi, whose parents I had the honor of marrying. So Naomi, we have a long history even before you came into being. Naomi helped to lead the organization's 2020 Get Out the Vote effort, that's the Women for Change, to engage and inform potential voters. She graduated from Indiana University with degrees in journalism and Jewish studies and will attend the University of Michigan Law School in the fall of 2021. Welcome, Naomi. And moderating our conversation tonight is David Sklar, who is the Assistant Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. He needs no introduction to this forum, to this community. We thank David for his service and leadership through the political, civic, and interfaith communities. He is a board member and chair of Beth-El Tzedek's Social Justice Initiatives. He grew up at Beth-El Tzedek, and now he and his wife, Sarah, are raising their wonderful children, Max and Sydney, at the synagogue where he himself became bar mitzvah and was confirmed. David, thank you for joining us for this evening's program, which I will soon turn over to you. But before doing so, I'd like to remind everyone that we will not have a Cocktail Judaism event in January, but then we will return in 2021. I like to say that 2020 was supposed to be the year of vision. Things got a little bit blurry. So hopefully 2021 will be the year of hindsight. So please join us on February 1st with Rabbi Bob Alper for an evening of Jewish stand-up comedy. He even has better jokes than I do. And then on March 1st with our own Shari Rudofsky of the Indianapolis Star, who will discuss with us being a journalist and reporting medical news in a time of pandemic. We have other programs in process and will inform you as we go along. So thank you all for joining us tonight. This is Cocktail Judaism, so l'chaim, everybody. The first word, the first question in the Torah is ayeka, which means in Hebrew, where are you? So David, I turn it over to you, and perhaps that's a good place to begin. Ayeka, where are you?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's great to be with everybody again this evening for our second edition of post-election conversation. This is a wonderful group of young leaders that we have with us tonight. I've had the pleasure of working with all of them. There was a time where I would have considered myself a young leader, but now apparently I need no introduction. So I am past the young leader stage, but luckily we have a new up-and-coming group of folks, of young adults here in our community who are taking on that mantle and continuing to lead us. And so I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation. Just a quick housekeeping before we begin. We will shoot for about an hour's worth of conversation. I have some questions that I have written out and shared with the panelists, so that will kick off our conversation, but this is really a discussion amongst us all, an opportunity for conversation. And so I will hope sooner than later our discussion entices you all to ask some questions of yourselves, and go ahead and put those in the chat box as they come to you, and we will make sure to try to get to as many as we possibly can. And I, of course, apologize if we aren't able to get to everybody's questions this evening, but I hope that we will have more questions from you than from me this evening as the discussion kicks off. So with that, let's get going, and I'll turn it over to our panelists. And I think Rabbi Dennis's question is a great one to get us started. How are you? It's now December 7th, just a little over a month since the election, and so just maybe take 2 minutes each and tell us how you are, how you're feeling as we move into the post-election world, and that will kick us off into the other questions. So, Naomi, do you want to start? How are you feeling? 2 minutes, right off the top of your head. How are you feeling?
I'm good. How are you feeling, David?
Good. I'm doing okay. Thank you.
I'm excited to be here. I think I'm feeling anxious in part. Of course, there were a lot of feelings coming out of the election. I'm also nervous about COVID and about how people in Indiana are handling the pandemic, especially related to mask wearing and social distancing. And I'm really concerned about how science has become something up for debate, and I think that's something that we need to work on. But I'm also feeling really hopeful. I'm super excited about all the news about vaccines. I'm also hopeful because I see all of the work that organizations like Women for Change is doing, and like the JCRC is doing, and people like Erin and Rachel. I think we've seen the best in people, especially last month to some degree. So I'm feeling hopeful, and I'm excited about hopefully what the next few months will bring.
Great. Erin, how about you?
I echo a lot of what Naomi is saying. I think that leading up to the election was for everyone a very nerve-wracking time and anxious, and a lot of inability for people to be able to talk to people across the aisle. I think that, like Naomi said, there's also a lot of hope to be had. I think that we are starting to see conversations that are not just around politicians anymore, but actually around policy, which I think is really beneficial to being able to find and build bridges between different people in different communities. I also know that there still is a lot of anxiety around what is happening with the counting of ballots. And I think that there are a lot of conversations within my friend groups and different areas that I talk to that really are still wanting to talk about election reform and access and these very important topics. I think that, long story short, there's a lot of hope to be able to have when it comes to really trying to build these inroads.
Rachel, how about you? How are you feeling tonight?
I am feeling good. It seems we're all on the same page. That's a good start. Always a good place to be. I share a lot of the same, going into the election, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worries. But I think coming out, this is the most I've ever seen anyone my age, especially my friends and those around me, care about what I do and what I've always cared about. And that brings me hope for the future. And I'm worried that post such a crazy election, people might not continue to care about the policy side of things, but I am more, at least, than in the past will. And that's always good because having an educated community can only lead to great things.
Great. Well, you've kind of forced me, I think, to Rachel actually, I think all of you jump to my second question. But I think you all kind of led into it. And so I think I'll just start there. This was a very contentious election. We're still not completely out of election season. Obviously, a lot of discussion about, I think we can all sort of figure out in our own way how to describe the proceedings after the election. But clearly that discussion continues. I think whether it was before the election or since the election, there has been a lot of strain on our institutions, on our political institutions, on our bureaucratic institutions, on our court systems, and things like that. I think we were all very happy to see that young folks came out to vote in higher numbers in this last election, and that's excellent. But I guess my question to you all is, do you have any concerns that that strain on our institutions or the conversation post-election will turn off the sort of Gen Z, your generation, from continuing to want to remain involved in either politics or policy discussions? Anybody want to start with that one? Rachel, you want to start since you were the last one to kind of bring that up?
Sure, yeah. Like I said, I do worry a little bit, try to remain hopeful because there's no point in trying to be negative all the time. But I think just politics and policy in general is a topic that our generation doesn't tend to enjoy talking or thinking about. And I think that's where it stems. And I do worry that because everything was so crazy this last time around, that it will push them further away from it. But, like you said, we had the highest turnout of our age group ever. And so that does give me hope that maybe those people will wonder a little less the more that they can learn and educate themselves on what's going on around them. Hopefully in the future, you get to less of a contentious political debate and just a diverse campaigning season as a whole.
So Naomi, what can everyone do to keep the interests of Gen Z engaged in these kinds of discussions?
Well, you said that you're worried that there's a lack of confidence in these institutions, and I think to start with, you have to ask why. And I think institutions are not like concepts, they're made up of people and policies, and those people and policies have failed people my age, and you can look to events like the Great Recession. We were in middle school, but you can also just look at how these institutions are handling this pandemic. I think it's important to show us that the institutions work, that our votes matter. And I think part of the way to do that is for political parties to invest in kids at a younger age. For example, I'm seeing that in Georgia, the campaigns are almost begging 17-year-olds who will turn 18 by the election to register to vote. So on one hand, you're talking to these people for the first time, you're begging them to vote, and then there's huge discourse about whether the ballots mattered, and they were, all the discussion around whether the election was stolen. So I think these institutions have to do right by us and invest in us in order to increase confidence.
Aaron?
Yeah, so I think that, taking institutions more broadly than just our elected leaders and systems our institutions are also our community organizations and different groups that come together to mobilize around elections and different policies. And so I think this is a big discussion that is happening within a nonprofit world, within the political world. But I think that it is kind of a push and a pull, and that in the sense that everything Naomi said about institutions needing to look at why people are anti-institution. But we also need to evaluate and realize that our institutions do exist for a reason too. Just looking at the Jewish community, many of our Jewish institutions exist to protect Jews, be our voice in the state house, in Congress, etc. So these are important things. So I guess the long term here is we really need to evaluate and look at our institutions and see if they are failing and see where they're successful. I always like to kind of think of institutions in the sense that they're like people. They get to grow and develop and change, and that's healthy and natural as they become stronger and better institutions. but they have to be allowed to do that. So exactly back to Naomi's point of looking at where institutions are failing, a lot of times it is policies and practices that have been part of these institutions for a long time. And people say, well, this is how it's always been done. And one positive antidote I will say about institutions and mobilization is if you look at the election, specifically in Michigan, that the Muslim community after the 2016 election really mobilized this year, educating the community on civic engagement and duties. And they had some of the highest voter turnout rate in the country within the Muslim community there. So I think institutions really do play a key part when they're listening to the people they serve.
Great. Well, we have our first questions, and I'm going to wrap Sandy's sort of second part question, and it actually coincides with the first question that I have on my list for all of you, and that is, what are your hopes for the immediate future? I guess what issues are on your personal radar? What would you like to see worked on in the coming weeks and months? And then I guess add what you think are the top pressing issues of your peers, your friends, and your colleagues, and we'll see if there's some consensus among all of them. Aaron, do you want to just go ahead and keep going and talk about your immediate hopes and what you think is on the agenda of your peer group?
Yeah. So my immediate hope is that that the younger generation will get more educated on these issues and really start to understand, I think, strategy and how to think through. Again, it's a push and pull where a lot of times we want to see the change now because it needs to be seen for so many people. And yet at the same time, there is importance of understanding strategy. So I think that one of my big hopes is really working with with my generation and younger generations to really think through these strategies. And strategy is so much more than just being, again, lobbying, but it's also strategic relationships and learning, meeting people and having these conversations. And I think that there's a really unique lens where you always have your policy thinkers who are going to know policy through and through, but that doesn't always speak to everyone. And I think linking your relationship builders and your policy strategists together is one major hope and way, I think, moving forward. I think that when looking at my generation and honestly what many of my friends are facing is they're not making rent, they're not making enough, whether they're service workers, whether they are hourly working in retail. Quite honestly, I have plenty of friends who didn't go to college because that was never a privilege to them. So they're working hourly jobs and they're not making enough because of the way that the pandemic has affected them. So housing, eviction, I don't necessarily buy into completely the $15 minimum wage always. I think it's more complicated than just a blanket raising a minimum wage, but I do think we really need to assess what it means to have a livable income and be able to afford to be out in the world as an adult.
Okay. So we've got sort of strategy as a generation and economic stability issues from Aaron. Rachel, what about you?
I'm glad I'm next because I actually feel a lot of the same what Aaron said. I think people my age tend to not think about the economy, and they really should. It should be on everybody's mind. It ties back to everything that everyone cares about. You think about social justice issues, you think about the pandemic and what we're going to do from here. You can't fix any of those without money. You want to add education, that costs money. You want to do all these things. I mean, the economy is real and it's important, I think, to say that our whole generation or just young people as a whole, I think it's hard to say what we care about because as every other community, there's a large diversity among us, and I think most of us care about different things than others. You know, Erin and I talk about this stuff all the time, and we have totally different opinions. But moving on to my hopes, is that they do what we do, which is openly communicate. I hope that our generation is younger than us start to talk more about the things that they don't want to talk about or that they're afraid of talking about. Because the more we can learn about each other, the more we can learn about these institutional problems like social justice reform and something that's pandemic. How do we move forward without any history of something like this? You know, our generation has never experienced anything like this. And so I think there's a lot of ignoring the problem and doing whatever we want because we're afraid to talk about it. So just having those conversations, educating ourselves. Personally, for me, it always goes back to education. The more you know, the more you can do.
Naomi?
My personal short-term hopes and goals are all related to the, or largely related to the pandemic, also to a smooth transition to the next president. Really concerned about an equitable distribution of the vaccine, for example. In terms of what I think people my age or my generation cares about, I agree it comes down to education, Rachel. I sort of disagree that we don't think of the economy. I just think many people our age don't have the language to talk about it in the same way. And that's where I think the education comes in. But when we're talking about rent, like Erin mentioned, for example, or student loans, et cetera, we're talking about the economy. But you're right that maybe we don't all know how to discuss it at the same level. Yeah.
So just, we're going to get into some different topics. I want to come back to COVID maybe a little bit in the conversation, but to kind of wrap up or maybe work our way out of the election conversation. I guess one thing I'm interested in, we've talked a little bit about engagement and voting. How do you guys, we've obviously asked you here tonight for this conversation because you represent a particular voice somewhere on the left-right spectrum. You're all sort of work for nonpartisan organizations or businesses or at least that work across the aisle. But thinking about our political system right now, do you guys feel like you really have a home in one party or the other? Do you feel comfortable with the political establishment that exists nowadays? And if not, what can our existing political parties do to better reach out and engage young voters? Rachel?
Yeah, I definitely, qualify myself in one category or the other, but do I necessarily feel 100% comfortable there? No, I don't. I think I like the way you worded the question because my biggest issue with the party system as a whole is right now, I find at least on both sides, there's a huge disconnect between the young and the old, and there's no communication. And I find it hard, at least myself as a young person in the field, to be taken seriously because I am very young. And so I find that's where a lot of the disconnect continues to happen, at least definitely within my own party. There's not enough conversation, communication, and listening. And it goes both ways. I don't think we want to listen to the older generation either. We tend to jump to I know better because I'm young and I'm in it. And then the same way, I'm old and wise, and so you can't possibly know anything. I think that what the parties can both do and listen within their own communities and their own spaces. What do the younger generation see for the party? Historically, parties are meant to change time. It's a group of people coming together over common values, and as society goes about itself, we change, and so our values change. And I think that parties will continue to change and their values will continue to change. And I think that there's a little bit of disconnect between the young and the old within parties right now. And I think that would be a great place to start for positive change in the future.
Naomi?
So the question is, do I feel comfortable identifying with one party versus another?
And obviously you don't have to identify yourself, but do you feel like you have a place, or are you somewhere in the middle?
I do feel like I have a place. I wouldn't say that I check every box. I don't think anybody could agree with their party on everything. I'll say I think that people my age are less worried, like I'm not carrying my party card in my wallet kind of thing. I think we're less worried about whether we fit every, duet. I think we're less worried about matching everyone in our party and more concerned about like kind of what Rachel said, pushing the party and moving the party forward and to our benefit.
Yeah, I think if you had asked me this question, and David probably knows this better than anyone right now, if you had asked me this question probably 3 years ago when I first started the JCRC, I would say yes, definitely. I think that's changed a lot. I don't know if I have a political home, but I also don't know if a lot of people have political homes. The more and more I talk to, especially migration, it's really hard because we see the racism in both parties. We see the misogyny, the anti-Semitism. You go down the list, the power structures that allowed these people to stay within these institutions and turn a blind eye to their own faults. I think that for me personally, as someone who is very progressive when it comes to many policies conversations, that it's been really eye-opening to see as I work with anti-Semitism every day, some what is happening on the left and not listening to Jewish voices, or only listening to a few Jewish voices that may uphold certain opinions. And I think also then towards the other side, we have on the right, where you're seeing the politicalization of Israel, the Jewish identity, and hiding that behind white supremacy. So I think for me in the space I live in, as working with to fight anti-Semitism daily, it's definitely changed my views of having a political home. But I think that's not bad, because I think it gives a unique lens of being able to see the fault and both sides instead of getting your blinders up for one side. I think that is where we're going to be able to find bridge builders, and we're going to be able to then address these systemic issues that are on both political homes. And like I said, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, you go down that list. So that's what I look forward to. I look forward to, and you're going to hear me probably say it 1,000 times tonight, more bridge building.
Great. So our next question comes in from my good friend Dieter Mills. So I'm going to ask it specifically, and I want to talk about the specific issue that she raises, which is, are up and coming Jewish young leaders like yourselves concerned about racial injustice? I'm just going to read it sort of word for word because I think it's a good question. So, are up and coming Jewish leaders concerned about racial injustice? And what is far too often the quote unquote shoot first, ask later epidemic facing Black and brown people. So the first part of this question that I want to ask is, how are you as young leaders in the Jewish community embracing the conversation about racial injustice and racial equity? And then the second smaller piece that I want to add on to it is on any issue like racial injustice, or Naomi, whether it's COVID and believing in science, or it could be any number of controversial issues that we might discuss tonight, or we're all going to engage in over time. Is the younger generation, is your sort of Gen Z group of peers as polarized as it would seem the national body politic is? Do you guys think that Gen Z is a little bit more embracing of differing viewpoints?
So there are a few questions in there. The first
I lumped a lot together there. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. In terms of, so
racial injustice.
Yeah. I'm rereading the question. I think I know obviously we're thinking about it a lot. I think that we're less polarized on the issue, but I believe that people my age are thinking about all of the issues we discussed through the lens of equity and diversity, whether it's COVID or the economy or student loan forgiveness, education policy. I don't think that this is a side issue to us. I think it's a part of everything that we do. For example, I work for Women for Change. I am working to improve the lives of Hoosier women, as we say. And I think a lot about what do these numbers mean specifically for women of color in Indiana. So a Black infant in Indiana is 2.2 times more likely to die than a white infant. And 1 in 3 Hoosier women lives in a county without these services. And we know that that's especially true for women of color. So I guess my answer is we're not separating it from everything else the way I think specifically some white adults do. It's become of everything. And I think that that's how it should be.
Rachel?
I definitely agree with that whole latter portion. I think that that's really true. We do, I think, tend to see it as a lens to view everything else, which is really important, because the more you polarize that topic, the more it becomes a polarizing thing. I think that I personally find in the sphere that I've been in and those that I've had conversations with that like Naomi said, social justice, things like that, equality, I no longer think are party issues, and I don't think many people our age do. But I do think that the party that you're in is still a big thing. I often find when I share my party, a lot of people will shut down communication before the conversation even starts. And again, that's my personal opinion, my personal experience. But I definitely find a lot of that. But I also always bring that back to, I think a lot of people my age just don't want to talk politics at all. And so they hear difference and just shut it down so that they don't have to continue the conversation, which concerns me. But I think generally speaking, we are a little more becoming, especially post-election, more open to having the conversations, which is good. I think, do we care about racial injustice? Yes, absolutely. But I think I've talked to a lot of community leaders in various communities, especially those of color, and most of us have agreed that you can't have a wider spread conversation across an entire country before you fix problems within your own community. And we're trying to jump to, I want everyone to know that I care, so let me go on this broad field. And I think we need to rein that back in. Talk to those around you, talk to people you know of color about their experiences, or those not of color who haven't had those experiences and how they perceive life. I think all of it's very important to bring it all together and make a change. These changes didn't happen overnight and they aren't going to be fixed overnight. So again, and you'll hear me, like Erin said, say this all night long. I think it's all about conversations, having those open conversations, uncomfortable conversations with everyone across all aisles.
Erin?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take Deetra's second part of her question first. Do you feel connected to this issue generally or specifically? Yes, resounding yes, because because when we talk about the Jewish community, we're not just talking about people who are white. We're not just talking about wealthy Jews, those stereotypes. We're talking about all Jews. And so just from that standpoint of when looking in the Jewish community, yes, because there are community members too. I also feel that we really, when we look at building up a healthy society, that means that we have to be in it and ready to fight where systemic issues exist completely and fully. And so that means that we need to be addressing these issues. And I know this may put maybe some hairs on the back of people's necks, but to the first question, shoot first and ask later. when we are having white gunmen, white supremacists able to gun down people and harm protesters, etc., and they are not getting, and they are able to walk away with their life, then we really need to think about what we mean by safe policing and community policing, and understanding that there obviously is an inequity and a miss and our system needs to be fixed. And so, yeah, sorry. So just a resounding yes to that. I think that, that one thing I really liked about what Rachel said is that it, so much of it does start on a smaller level. It's hearing those stories, but it's also being afraid to look inside our community. Obviously we need to fight bigotry outside our community, but we also need to understand it exists within our community. And so until, and that's the first step. We is really going in and working to fix our own community, the racism that's in there, and the other forms of bigotry and hate that exist. And it's because we are a minority community does not mean we absolve ourselves of also leading to the oppression of others.
Great, and I've got another policy-specific question that I will throw out to all of you, and then we'll get into some other subjects. So the question is that the questioner is curious about the issue of climate change and the perspective of young people, and where you all see it's heading on that particular issue. Anybody want to start? Rachel, I see you looking for the mute button.
Oh man, sure. So I mean, just generally like my thoughts, feelings, opinions on climate change.
Sure.
Okay. I guess I'll start with I think it's real. It's important. It goes back to Naomi's leading with science, and it's hard, I think, to convince people who don't want to lead with science that they should. That's one of those conversations I personally think no one will ever win. So that's right. But this also goes back to what I was saying before within the differences between the younger and the older generations, and the differences they have in the lack of communication. I find on my party, a lot of older people like to ignore the topic of climate change, and a lot of younger people would not like to ignore it. I think that just by nature of the changing administration, you'd hope that they would put some awesome people out there to, work on it and see what we can do. I think it's hard to say. There's, again, like I said before, without history and evidence, it's hard to move forward and fix something. We know what we know, but we don't know what we don't. I think the more research, the more we can find out, the more we can figure out what we can do. Obviously, moving to natural resources and natural sources of power versus these things that we know for a fact are not good for the air and for the climate. The small changes I think that we know that we can make. But again, I think what people fail to understand a lot of the time is what of the economy is involved in that. It's expensive to destroy an entire industry, and it's even more expensive to replace it with a new one. And the newer the science, more likely it is to be expensive. So I always like to think, obviously I'm not saying don't do it because it's expensive, but I think the topic also should change, or at least be started with, how can we do that realistically and fiscally responsibly? How can we implement these changes into our country and do better?
Sorry, I'm looking for my mute button. Naomi, take it. Climate change.
Yeah. Rachel, I really liked a lot of what you said, and specifically as it relates to science. Yeah, I think it's on our minds, and I think you're right. It's the economy plays a huge role in all of this. I think maybe as younger people, we're thinking more long term. I don't want to speak for all young people or all old people, but in terms of what will this look like for the economy in 50 years, I think that one piece of progress I'm noticing is so much of the destruction that's happening related to climate change is because of what corporations are doing. And I think we're noticing that, and we're holding corporations accountable. You've seen a number of big companies promising to go carbon neutral by 2030 or whatever it might be. I think it's amazing that there's going to be this new position on the cabinet specifically related to climate change. And I'm just hoping for more cooperation between parties and between countries. I don't think that we'll make as much progress as we need to when we do this in silos. I also just think it's interesting to consider like how fast this all seemed. I mean, when I learned about climate change in middle school, for example, it seemed like something that was going to happen in 100 years, but it feels really immediate for us. And I would say I'm so impressed by people even 5, 6, 7 years younger than we are, and how much they care about climate change and the kinds of things they're talking about and asking questions about. So I'm really excited to see the progress they're going to make as well.
Yeah, I think climate change is it's such a vastly important topic. There's so many different lenses to look at it. One of, I think, my major focus when we talking about climate change and especially environmental justice is looking at not necessarily the ocean and the seas and the natural habitats. Obviously that plays a part, but also looking at the human component and the justice that exists in there. So many of and it goes back to a lot of what we just talked about with racial justice too. Black and brown communities that are where you put the oil rigs and where you put the different toxins. I mean, when you think about Flint, Michigan, that is a environmental and climate change issue. When you think about East Michigan, Indiana, that has just as high a rate of lead poisoning as Flint, that has gone unnoticed. These are all intertwined with environmental justice. And then obviously we have the increase of storms and hurricanes that affect those living coast, displace people, many people who already who struggled with housing and who struggled with other necessities. We're seeing it, one of the big areas that I work on advocacy is with the Rohingya people who are facing a genocide. And one of the biggest concerns each year that is growing is the way that the typhoon season has increased and is tearing down their what they have to live in, which are essentially huts in the camps. So when we talk about climate change, I think that we really need to kind of parse out all the different areas too, because I agree so much to what Rachel said, which is that we also need to think about the economic ends. But I think that there's ways as we kind of go into this new way of thinking of equity and justice that we can make climate change equitable. We can make that economical with equity. And so, yeah.
Great. Well, that's really interesting. Aaron, I'll just do a quick correction. And East Chicago, not East Michigan.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. All right, I'm gonna totally switch gears here on us a little bit and try to. We've only got about 10 or 15 minutes left before I've got to turn it over to Rabbi. So let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. Aaron will certainly tell you at the JCRC we have started looking at anti-Semitism. Less on a straight left-right spectrum or as a horseshoe, where the extreme ends of either side of that spectrum, both the left and the right, are much closer together than they are apart. And so, I want us to, again, kind of put our political hats back on a little bit and think about, both wings of that spectrum. On the left or progressive side, we as a community have a lot of challenges with sort of the progressive left and how they discuss Israel as an issue, how they engage with Israel, how they view members of the Jewish community and to a certain extent allow Jewish members of the Jewish community into conversations about progressive issues And then on the right, we have a growing willingness to accept extremism, conspiracy theories that are often couched in anti-Semitism or utilize anti-Semitic tropes. And so, my question, and this is I think a particularly challenging one, but again, with your Gen Z political hats on, what can your generation do on either sides of that spectrum to, push back either against that sort of left-leaning anti-Israel progressivism on the left, if that's where you find yourself, or against a conservative, more conservative movement that's willing to embrace what's often anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So I know that's a really challenging one, but we're going to do our best. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah. So I think first, we have to understand that because of the way anti-Semitism often manifests in conspiracy theories, and I'm going to push back a little bit on David's question, that we actually see, and oftentimes it's actually on college campuses, we're seeing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories be accepted by the left too, just caked in different language or coded in different language. But I think what we need to really do is take a scalpel approach to many of these things because of the way anti-Semitism manifests, and not just a bulldozer. We have to be very thoughtful, and sometimes it's really frustrating, but it also lends itself to, I think, better addressing the issue. I also think that what we really need to look at with anti-Semitism is kind of two fronts, which is understanding how other communities perceive anti-Semitism and understand it to manifest. A lot of times it's through their own history and of their own oppression that they think anti-Semitism is one thing, not understanding how it may manifest in different ways than other oppressions. And I think that with that, we also need to look at how the Jewish community then responds to anti-Semitism. This is why I say it's a scalpel approach, because if you, and there's a lot of thought, but I was just on a call a couple weeks ago with April Baskin, who is a black Jew who is currently living in Senegal and addressed anti-Semitism and racial inequities within the Jewish community. And she spoke a lot about how we need to look within the Jewish community to our responses, because oftentimes the way we respond to anti-Semitism actually does the opposite effect of how we want to address it. It can actually isolate Jews and even more so, and us not able to find the partners we need. And that can be really frustrating. I think this is where the difference is with Gen Z and maybe older generations within our community, is that we understand the complexities of that there's a lot of things happening in the world. It's not, I don't think so much of our generation is one issue based anymore. We have a plethora of issues that we find all intersect in some way together. So I think that the older generation, in a lot of ways, very much looks at tends to look at anti-Semitism, especially as black and white, instead of something more nuanced. So I'll leave it there for the others, because David knows I could talk forever about this.
Rachel, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is probably like the number one topic Aaron and I talk about. Aaron's favorite topic in general. I actually just think the answer is quite simple, and it's what I've been saying all night: conversation. It's the biggest issue here. People, the amount of times when I moved here, I come from a community in South Florida where there's an extraordinarily large Jewish population. And the community here is strong and it's great, but comparatively across the country, it's not as big. The amount of times I had people in college tell me I was the first Jewish person they'd ever spoke to and ask me crazy questions that it took me actually a while to realize they're not ridiculous. I just don't know. And it's my job as a young person in that community to teach them what I know and get their gears working and let them, explore for themselves more education on it. I think that's just conversation and education here for me is everything.
Naomi?
Thank you for the question. I don't necessarily know the answer, and I think I look to Aaron, to his leadership on this, and to the JCRC's leadership on this. I think when it comes to anti-Semitism on the right, my advice would probably be to combat the conspiracy theories. Like, and I agree with Aaron that there's definitely conspiracy theories on the left as well. But for example, I think close to 24 congressional candidates had some sort of affiliation with the conspiracy group QAnon, which has anti-Semitic roots, and I think 2 of them won actually. So I would say publicly discouraging participation in those conspiracy theories. When it comes to the left, this is something that is really hard for me, and I think about all the time. I definitely think that there's a lack of nuance on the left. And I think I really agree with Rachel said. I think it comes down to education, both internally and externally. I think so many people don't seem to know what they're talking about when they discuss so many people who aren't intimately familiar with the issue can't separate Israel from American Jews, for example. I just think that there needs to be a stronger emphasis on nuance. I also think there needs to be more education internally. I think we don't prepare young Jews for how to have conversations about Israel on college campuses. JCRC is doing an amazing job with that, but I don't think that was especially popular when I was a kid, for example. You're taught how to love Israel, but you're not taught how to have conversations with people who not only don't know much about Israel, but who hate Israel. And so I think encouraging nuance and educating young Jews would both be a helpful start.
Great. I think those are some really great nuanced answers. So I'm going to work on my screen back in the same direction that we came, just in reverse order for our last question, and then I'll turn it over to Rabbi Dennis. And I think it's a great question, and maybe just take 1.5 minutes to answer this. And again, it comes from Dietrich Mills, and it is, what do you all as panelists think that the quote unquote more wizened members of the Jewish community who are here with us tonight can do to be supportive of your leadership? So Naomi, why don't you start again, and then we'll work back in reverse order.
What can you do to encourage, support leadership growth? That's a really good question, and something I would have to think about, I think, to give you the answer that you deserve. I think listening when we speak is a great start, and obviously thank you for creating this space for us to talk. And I interned for the JCRC in college, and I'm so grateful for all the opportunities you create for young people to have these difficult conversations. Yeah, I just welcoming us to the table is huge, and like I said earlier with the political parties, I think don't engage us. Like political parties shouldn't wait to engage us when we're 18. Jewish institutions shouldn't wait to engage us. We can become donors, for example. I think there's a lot of missed opportunities to engage young people in our age group, college and out of it. But I'm seeing a lot of change on that, and I'm grateful. So just keep doing what you're doing with events like these and opportunities like these.
Yeah. I think that, again, so much of what Naomi said, but really engaging with us, not just thinking that we don't know what we're talking about. I think that we, for better or for worse, we are the generation that grew up with the internet. So I think that in a lot of ways we have had exposure in different ways than maybe previous generations have. And I think that we really could use the ability to hear your own experiences. I think that and so I'm going to kind of flip question back to us, though, is one thing with us, it is that we don't hear the narratives and the conversations of why people, especially older generations, feel the way they do. There's so much of our own Jewish history, and then outside of that, so much other history we don't know. I mean, just for example, and I'm only bringing this up because it happened this weekend. I mean, it was the anniversary of the largest, one of the largest marches in DC to free the former Soviet Union Jews. And that's a huge part of our history that is unknown. I didn't know about it until I started working at the JCRC. So I think it's, you know, a give and take of being willing to share these stories and narratives and understanding each other and that intergenerational divide, but then also realizing that we really do want the best for our community too, and to with us on seeing that vision.
I definitely agree so much with the both of them, just get almost every word. Actually, yeah, every word. I think this is a great question. I love this so much. And I think exactly what Naomi said, just exactly this, what we're doing right here. An open conversation, my favorite answer of the night, just talking. And that comes from both sides, of course, but you're asking what you guys can do. So just talk, but also at the same time, be willing to listen and understand. I think I've had too many a conversation where people, they've been willing to listen and you talk and then it's just an argument, not a conversation. So when you're having those conversations, listen and try and understand as best you can. I think, like Aaron said, with us being the age of the internet, we have a whole other perspective on life that I'm sure would be very hard to understand outside of growing up that way, and vice versa for us without growing up this way. So just being able to sit down, have those conversations and genuinely listen to each other. And then again, of course, when you want to go back to institutions, having your institutions put on an event like this, I think is obviously always wonderful, and a great way to move forward.
All right. Well, wonderful. Aaron, I appreciate you bringing that up. I know that there are folks on this call that were, you know, Rabbi Dennis and Rabbi Sandy. I think I saw Marcia Goldstone pop up earlier. You know, these were folks, and apologies, I'm definitely not trying to miss anybody, but folks that were not only local leaders but national leaders on that movement to free Soviet Jewry. So, you know, to those folks listening, to all of you listening tonight, you know, who were part of movements like that in the past, I know we all thank you. And again, you know, I've had the pleasure of working with all three of our panelists tonight in some capacity or another, and they really are all special people. And you know, I think our future is bright as a community with folks like this who are continuing to engage in our discussions and our dialogue as a community. And so I've really enjoyed the opportunity with all three of you tonight. So with that, Rabbi Dennis, I humbly turn it back over to you. And thank you again for the opportunity to be with these panelists for these last two sessions.
Thank you, David. And before I thank you and our wonderful panelists, I want to acknowledge Shari Levine, our executive director, and Jackie Goldstein, our communications coordinator, for keeping us connected during this and so many other productive conversations that we have had. There is so much that has been said tonight that could be used as material for future conversations. I would be particularly interested in continuing to explore the issue of anti-Semitism and how do we respond to it out of our own traditions, because the issue is deep and the issue is contextual, not only in terms of current political left and right issues, but it really goes down to the very foundations of Western civilization. And we need part of the understanding of that. And I hope that we can explore that in the future. Let me finish by alluding to a passage from the prophet Joel that has been turned into a beautiful popular song by Debbie Friedman. It says, the old shall dream dreams and the young shall see visions. And I think that what we have experienced tonight is a coming together of the dreams and the visions in the present lived reality. And we have some young people who have shared with us tonight their visions, but they are visions that have been seasoned by their love and their participation in the dreams of their families and in the dreams of our people. We will soon be celebrating the festival of Hanukkah, and we all talk about that story of the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 days. Well, I'd suggest to you the miracle of Hanukkah is not that the oil lasted for 8 days, but it has lasted for 2,000 years. And the people who are showing the light and the brightness and the future hopes are the people who have participated in the conversation tonight. So I'd like to thank Naomi and Aaron and Rachel for sharing their wisdoms, their hopes, their ideals with us, and for opening for all of us ways of thinking. We look forward to continuing these conversations because we truly value what you bring to the community. And we don't want you to wait for an invitation to participate, but if there is anything you feel that it is important to bring to the attention of the community, you know that you have our ear. We begin with the concept of Shema, of listening, and this is a theme that has been repeated by many of you. So Shema, let us listen to one another. We thank you for allowing us to listen to you tonight. David, thank you for coordinating a wonderful, moderating a wonderful conversation, and thank you to our panelists. Have a happy Hanukkah, and let us hope that the new year will bring hope and renewed visions for all of us. Thank you, and we'll look forward to getting together in the months and years ahead. Stay in touch. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Happy
you so
Hanukkah.
much for having us.
Thank you.
So say hello to everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Say hi to
Good
your
program. Thank you.
And, let us know if there's anything that we can be of assistance with.